I died from an allergy attack my husband engineered on purpose, 4 minutes before anyone thought to call 911. Reborn a decade earlier as this ship's chef, I film every single meal prep now, every plated dish, every pill bottle. Building the case against Weston before he gets the chance to build the crime. Today the camera is wedged behind the spice rack angled at my prep station, recording nothing more dramatic than me deveining shrimp for 40 guests who haven't been born into this particular disaster yet. My hands don't shake anymore when I do this. They used to the first few hundred times. I have done this exact prep, on this exact stretch of teak countertop, more mornings than I can count anymore. I know which knife pulls slightly left. I know the captain announces final boarding at 11 sharp, not 10:55 no matter what the schedule says. I know down to the dish what I was plating the night I died. It was a chilled lobster and heirloom tomato salad, the closing course of the Ashcroft Founders Regatta Gala, the one meal of the year I never let anyone else touch from start to finish. I remember the particular blue of the tablecloths that year. I remember Weston's hand on my shoulder, warm, familiar, saying, "Just try a bite, you worked too hard on this to skip it." And I remember letting him talk me out of a rule I had never once broken in 6 years of marriage. I remember reaching for my bag. I remember the pen not working. I remember, with total clarity, that it should have worked, because I had checked it myself that morning, the way I checked it every morning, and somewhere between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. it had stopped being mine. 4 minutes. That's what the paramedics told my sister-in-law afterward, like it would be a comfort to know exactly how much time had separated me from staying alive. I woke up gasping in a galley that smelled like fresh paint and diesel and somebody else's cologne, and it took a full 10 seconds to understand I wasn't dying again. I was younger. My hands, when I held them up in front of my face, didn't have the faint scar from a boning knife I wouldn't get for another 2 years. The date on the crew schedule taped to the wall said I had 10 years, almost to the week before I would die in this exact kitchen from a decision made by a man I hadn't fallen in love with yet. Somewhere above deck, a radio was playing a song I hadn't heard in a decade, playing it for the first time, technically, and my whole body understood the wrongness of that before my mind caught up to it. I did not waste the 10 seconds after that crying about it. I want that understood up front, because everything I did next only makes sense if you understand I had already used up all my shock the first time. My name is Sloan Whitaker, and before any of this, I was already the kind of person who reads expiration dates twice. My mother died from anaphylactic shock when I was 14, at a work dinner where a kitchen mislabeled a sauce, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, understanding didn't matter anymore. I spent the rest of my childhood learning everything there was to know about the thing that killed her, partly out of grief and partly because I turned out at 17 to have inherited the exact same allergy myself, a cruelty so on the nose that a doctor once asked if I was joking when I told him. Shellfish. Every kind. Anaphylaxis within minutes if I'm not careful, which meant I built a career in the one industry that made avoiding it hardest on purpose, because I refused to let a dead woman's allergy shrink my life the way it had shrunk hers. I became a private chef instead of a line cook because private kitchens let you control every single variable. I got hired onto the Ashcroft family's yacht, the Meridian Star, out of Fort Lauderdale, 9 years before I would eventually marry into the family that owned it, and from day one I ran my galley like a surgical unit. Dedicated allergen-free tools. A locked case for my own EpiPen, checked every morning before the crew even had coffee. And one rule I never broke for anyone, not investors, not guests, not eventually my own husband. I plate my own protein myself, tasted and verified by my own hand, before it leaves this galley. No exceptions. Ever. I did not think that rule would matter to anyone but me. I was wrong about that in the worst possible way exactly once. This time waking up in the same galley a decade early, I kept the rule and added a new one. I started filming. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I did not spend the next decade being cold. I know how these stories usually go, the wronged woman who comes back sharpened into something that never laughs again. That wasn't me. I fell for Weston Ashcroft again, slowly the same way I had the first time, because he was for years genuinely worth falling for. He found me on the aft deck 3 weeks into my new contract, eating cold pasta straight out of a takeout container because I'd been too slammed to make myself a real dinner, and instead of doing what every other Ashcroft I'd met did, which was pretend not to see the help, he sat down across from me on the deck boards and said, "That looks tragic." I could fix you something better in about the same amount of time it's taking you to be sad about that. You cook badly, but with confidence, which counts for more than people think. He was, in those years, funny in a way his family's money hadn't beaten out of him yet, and careful with me in a way I didn't understand the weight of until much later, when I understood exactly what he'd eventually become and exactly how far that was from where he started. Cole Bennett showed up 2 charters later, a repeat client who booked the Meridian Star through a corporate account every few months, always requested the same cabin, always tipped the crew like he'd personally lived through a bad service job once and never forgot it. He was quiet in the specific way of men who've learned that saying less makes people underestimate exactly how much they're paying attention. You're the one who does the allergy-friendly menu without making it feel like a punishment, he said, the first time we actually talked, standing in the galley doorway with a curiosity that felt oddly specific for small talk. That's harder than people think. You've had a lot of bad allergy-friendly meals? I've had a lot of chefs who treat it like an inconvenience instead of a real risk. Something in how he said risk made me look up at him a beat longer than the conversation required. If you ever feel unsafe on this boat, for any reason you call me, not security. Me, I mean that. I remember thinking it was a strange thing for a charter guest to say to the chef he'd known for 11 minutes. I filed it under rich men say strange, intense things sometimes and went back to my prep, the same mistake I'd make about him for years, because I had no context yet for how much that sentence would end up mattering. Weston proposed on the same aft deck 18 months later, no ring hidden in a dessert, no elaborate staging, just him saying, I've watched you run a kitchen like it's a small, well-loved country, and I would like to be a citizen of it, permanently if you'll have me, which was such a strange, specific thing to say that I said yes before I'd fully processed it. His mother did not come to the engagement dinner. Constance Ashcroft sent a card instead, congratulating us on our news in handwriting so precise it looked typed. And underneath the signature in the same careful hand, one line that wasn't quite a threat and wasn't quite not one. I do hope you understand what you're taking on, dear. I kept that card. I have it still, in a fireproof box, item 1 in a file that would eventually need much more than a greeting card to matter. Vanessa Klein came up at the wedding, the way she always came up, in the specific tone Ashcroft family friends used when they mentioned her, a tone that assumed I already understood the context. Vanessa couldn't make it. Someone told me at the reception, unprompted, like I'd asked. She and Weston were quite serious years ago. Before you. I smiled and thanked them for the information I hadn't requested, and later that night, in bed, I asked Weston about her directly, because I already knew the answer and wanted to hear how he'd tell it. Ancient history, he said. My mother's never quite let it go, but I have. I believed him. I want that on the record too. For years I believed him completely, and for years he gave me no specific reason not to. We built a good marriage inside a complicated family, which is its own particular skill. He learned to run interference when Constance got cutting at dinner. I learned which financial conversations to leave the room for, because they were never really about money, they were about control, and I had no interest in giving her a single additional inch of it. The prenup, when we drew it up, was his idea, not mine, drafted with a clause so generous my own lawyer double-checked it twice. If the marriage ever ended, for any reason short of my own infidelity, I walked away with a settlement large enough to make me permanently, completely independent of the Ashcroft name. Why would you do that? I asked him, only half joking, give away that much leverage before you even need it? Because I don't want you ever staying for the money, he said. I want you only staying because you want to. I did not know yet that I was looking at the exact clause that would eventually make me too expensive to divorce and, in his mother's math, cheaper to grieve. We had rituals too, the kind that have nothing to do with danger. He stole bites off the pass every single night I cooked for just the two of us, always the same corner of whatever dish it was, always claiming it was quality control. That's not quality control, I told him more times than I could count. That's just theft with a job title. I'm the co-owner of this kitchen by marriage, I have equity. You have zero culinary judgment and a very good lawyer. Both true, he said, stealing another bite anyway, and for years that was the whole fight. The biggest thing wrong between us some nights was a missing corner of short rib. I let myself have that. I let myself believe for long stretches at a time that a marriage could just be this, small and warm and slightly ridiculous, and that the version of him waiting at the end of it might never actually arrive. The business trouble started in year 3, quietly at first, the way trouble always starts in families that have spent generations being good at hiding it. Ashcroft Yachting Group had overextended on 2 new builds right before fuel costs spiked, and Constance, who had run the company's finances since her own husband died, began having the kind of closed-door meetings that ended with Weston coming out looking 10 years older than when he went in. I knew, 'cause I'd lived this decade once already, that Vanessa Klein's family owned Sterling Marine Holdings, a competitor with exactly the kind of capital and dockage rights that could solve the Ashcrofts' problem in one clean acquisition. I knew Constance had spent years quietly nudging that solution forward, using the word merger the way other people use the word marriage. I knew, and I still had to watch it happen in real time, which turned out to be its own specific kind of torture, knowing a wound is coming and being unable to do anything, but reinforce the skin around it. Lila Ashcroft was 22 that year, finishing business school, and the only member of the family who ever sat with the crew instead of over us. In my first life, I remembered her going quiet and strange in my final months, avoiding my eyes at family dinners, and I'd assumed dying that she'd simply absorbed her mother's contempt the way the rest of them eventually did. This time I watched her more carefully. She wasn't cold. She was scared in the specific, controlled way of someone who has learned that showing fear in this family gets it used against you later. "You should be careful what you say around my mother this year," she told me once, refilling her wine at the galley door instead of asking a server, which I'd come to understand was her way of getting 5 private minutes. "She's under a lot of pressure about the merger." People under pressure look for the cheapest fix in the room. "Is that a warning?" "It's weather," Layla said. "I'm just telling you what's coming." I didn't push. I wrote it down instead in the same notebook where I logged everything else, because I'd learned the hard way that the people who tell you the truth sideways are often the only ones telling it to you at all. Over the next 2 years, Lila and I built something neither of us bothered naming. She'd bring her econ homework down to the galley counter instead of studying in the house proper. I'd feed her better than the family's private chef roster technically allowed, since I was on paper only supposed to cook for the yacht. Neither of us mentioned that this made her the closest thing to a real friend I had inside that family, because saying it out loud felt like handing Constance one more thing to eventually use. The forged bank statements showed up in year 4, mailed anonymously to Weston's office, showing a fabricated pattern of transfers out of the family's charitable trust into an account with my name on it. I found out because he asked me about it directly at midnight, holding printed pages with a face I'd never seen him wear before, somewhere between devastated and furious. "Explain this," he said, "because right now it looks like you've been stealing from my family for 2 years. I did not cry. I had cried about smaller things in my first life and it had never once bought me anything. I called the bank myself at midnight, got a supervisor on the phone through sheer refusal to hang up, and had a written confirmation within 18 hours that the account in question had never existed. Someone had built a convincing fake from scratch, with just enough real formatting to pass a first glance, and just enough urgency in its arrival to make sure Weston looked at it exhausted and alone, at midnight, instead of clear-headed in daylight. "It was your mother," I told him once the bank confirmation was in his hands. "I don't have proof of that specific part yet, but I will." He didn't argue with me. That was almost worse. It meant some part of him already knew. Cole was there more often that year than the charter calendar really explained, and I'd stopped pretending not to notice. He'd taken to eating a late dinner in the galley instead of the dining salon, which the other guests never did, sitting on the same stool at the counter, asking about my knife work like a man conducting a very long, very patient interview he never quite finished. "You always check that bag before service," he said one night, nodding at the small locked case I kept my EpiPen in, which I checked, out of old habit, before every single meal I plated. Every time. Like a ritual. "Bad allergy, bad history with it. I noticed you don't let anyone else near your protein station either." He said it lightly, but he was watching my hands, not my face, which was its own kind of tell if I'd known yet what to look for. "That's not standard kitchen practice. That's something more specific. You spend a lot of time thinking about my kitchen practices for a hedge fund guy." "I spend a lot of time thinking about risk," he said. "It's the family business, metaphorically." I laughed and let it go, because that was still the year I had no reason to wonder what a metaphor might be covering for. It would be almost 2 more years before I understood exactly how literal he'd actually been. The next Founders Regatta came and went without incident, and I spent the entire week beforehand so tightly wound I nearly quit twice, only to watch the gala pass in ordinary chaos, ordinary compliments on the lobster course, ordinary exhaustion afterward. I remember standing in the galley at midnight once the last plate was cleared, hands shaking with adrenaline that had nowhere left to go, and understanding for the first time that fork knowledge didn't mean safety. It just meant a much longer wait for the danger to actually arrive. Weston found me there, still in my apron, and didn't ask why I looked like I'd survived something. He just made me a cup of the terrible tea he insisted was better than coffee for calming down, sat across from me at the same counter where Cole usually sat, and said, "Whatever's been eating at you all week, I'm not going anywhere. I need you to know that. Whatever happens with my mother, with the business, with any of it, you're not losing me over it." I wanted so badly to believe he meant that with his whole chest. Some nights, I still think he did, right up until the moment it stopped being true. Vanessa started appearing at family events in year 7, first the edges, then closer, always with some business reason Constance provided before anyone could ask. Sterling Marine's merger talks had stalled, and Constance's solution, it turned out, was to remind Weston in every way she could manage exactly what he'd be getting back if the current arrangement ever ended. Vanessa had trained as a nurse once, before she married into Sterling money and let the license lapse, a detail Constance liked to mention approvingly, as if competence were hereditary and I'd simply been born without it. "She's just here for the Sterling contracts," Weston told me, more than once, in a voice that had started sounding like he was reassuring himself as much as me. "It's business. Your mother doesn't do anything that's only business." "I know my mother." "You knew her less than you think," I said, and immediately wished I hadn't, because it landed like an accusation instead of the warning I meant it as, and something closed in his face that I recognized, with a cold drop in my stomach from a version of this exact fight I'd already survived once. He didn't sleep well that whole stretch. I'd wake at 3 in the morning to find him standing at the cabin window, staring at nothing, and when I asked what he was doing he'd just say, thinking, in a voice that made it clear the thinking wasn't going anywhere good. I didn't push him to talk. I'd learned the first time around that pushing him only ever taught him to hide better. The money trouble got worse before it got better. Weston had quietly guaranteed a personal loan against his own shares in the company 2 years earlier, trying to cover a shortfall before his mother found out and used it against him, and by year 8 the loan was underwater in a way that made him, for the first time in his life, genuinely vulnerable to being managed. Constance found out anyway. Constance always found out, and once she had leveraged that specific and that private, she stopped being subtle about anything. "You have a decision to make about your marriage," I heard her tell him once, through a half-closed office door I had no business standing outside of. "The company cannot absorb both your debt and a messy, expensive divorce from a woman with a prenup that generous. I am not telling you what to do. I am telling you that you are running out of ways to avoid doing something." I did not hear what he said back. I heard the specific silence that meant he hadn't said anything at all. That was the night I gave Cole the second camera. I found him on the aft deck, where he always seemed to be exactly when I needed someone to be there, and I didn't explain everything, not yet, not the rebirth, not the decade of dying in advance of itself that I still didn't fully understand myself. I just told him I thought something was being planned against me, that I needed a backup system he could hold that nobody in this family would ever think to search. Because he wasn't family, he was just a guest who tipped well and asked good questions. He didn't ask why I trusted him with something this serious after 2 years of careful small talk. He just said, "Show me exactly where you want it. And slowing, if anything moves faster than we're planning for, you call me before you call anyone else on this boat." I mean that the same way I meant it the first year I met you. "You still remember exactly what you said that first year?" "I remember everything you've ever told me you were afraid of," he said. "It's sort of my whole job." I laughed, because it was such a strange, oversized thing to say about being a good listener. I didn't know yet how literally he meant it. The mask came off completely 3 weeks before that year's Founders Regatta, at a family dinner where Constance had clearly decided subtlety had stopped being useful. "I've never understood," she said over dessert, to the whole table, in the pleasant tone she used for her cruelest lines, "why Weston insists on keeping a member of staff at the head of this family instead of in the kitchen where she does her actual, considerable talent justice. It isn't an insult, Slowing, it's simply accurate. Some people are extraordinary within their role. Very few are meant to outgrow it. The table went quiet. Lila stared at her plate. Weston opened his mouth and nothing came out fast enough. I had spent 3 years in my first life absorbing lines exactly like that one, telling myself family just talks like this, telling myself I was being too sensitive, telling myself Weston would eventually fix it if I just gave him time. I had died still waiting for him to fix it. I did not wait this time. I've run this galley for 9 years without a single incident, Constance, which is 9 more years of consistency than this company's balance sheet can currently claim. I said it as pleasantly as she'd said hers, which made it land harder. I'd think you, of all people, would recognize the difference between staff and the person actually holding something together. Constance's smile didn't move, her eyes did. I excused myself before dessert was finished, which I would learn later was the first thing that had ever genuinely rattled her about me, because I had never once, in either life, walked away from her mid-sentence before. There's a conversation I wasn't in the room for, one Cole told me about honestly much later. Once there was no reason left to hide any of it, I'll tell it the way it happened. Special Agent Cole Bennett sat across a folding table from 2 colleagues in a field office 40 minutes from the marina, a case file open in front of him labeled Ashcroft Yachting Group. 3 years of financial records fanned out like a losing hand of cards. The merger numbers don't reconcile, he said. Sterling Marine's been laundering acquisition capital through Ashcroft's charter revenue for at least 2 years, and Constance Ashcroft signed every wire transfer herself. We have enough for a warrant on the financial side. What we don't have yet is anything explaining why she'd risk exposure to force a merger she could probably get through legitimate channels eventually. Maybe she's just impatient, his supervisor said. Maybe. Cole didn't sound like he believed it. There's a woman on that boat, the chef, married into the family. I think whatever Constance is racing against has more to do with her than the merger timeline does. You've gotten close to a source inside an active financial investigation, Bennett. Tell me that's just good instincts talking. Cole didn't answer that directly, which his supervisor would say later was itself the most honest answer he could have given. Back on the Meridian Star, I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew was that Leela had started finding reasons to be in the galley more often, and that the reasons had stopped being about wine. There's a federal financial investigation into my mother, she told me 3 days after the dinner where Constance humiliated me over dessert, her voice pitched low even though we were alone. I found out because our family's attorney had to loop me in, since I'm listed on some of the trust paperwork. It's about the Sterling merger. Money laundering, they think, or something close to it. How do you know this affects me? Because the agent leading it has chartered this boat 6 times in 2 years and only ever books when you're the chef of record. Lila watched my face carefully. I looked him up properly, Sloan. Cole Bennett doesn't run a hedge fund. He runs financial crimes cases for the Bureau. I don't think he's here for the sea air. She hesitated, and something in her expression cracked open further. There's something else. Weeks ago, my mother asked me offhand whether I'd noticed you seeming different lately, more careful, more watchful. I told her yes, because it was true and I didn't think anything of it. I think that's part of why she moved up whatever she's been planning. I'm sorry, I didn't know what I was handing her. I want to describe what that felt like, and the truest word I have is relief, immediately followed by a much colder feeling underneath it, because if Cole had spent 2 years building a case that happened to orbit my exact kitchen, it meant someone with real institutional power had been quietly circling the same danger I had, the whole time, and had never once told me the full truth of why. I found him that same night, on the aft deck, where he always seemed to be exactly when I needed someone to be there, and for the first time, I didn't wait for him to open the conversation. Your FBI said, you have been this entire time. He didn't deny it, he didn't look surprised either, which told me he'd been expecting this exact conversation for longer than I had. Financial Crimes Division, I've been building a case against your mother-in-law for 2 years. I should have told you the moment I understood how close it was sitting to you personally, and I didn't, because operationally I wasn't supposed to, and because personally, I was scared that if I told you the truth, you'd see me as a case file with good timing instead of a person who actually, he stopped himself. It doesn't matter what I was scared of, you deserve to know. Is that why you're always here, for the case? The case is why I first came back a second time, he said. It is not why I've come back the other 40. The Founders Regatta fell 9 days later, the same weekend it always did. the one fixed point in the Ashcroft calendar that never moved for anyone. Sterling Marine's merger vote was scheduled for the Monday after. Cole's warrant, he told me, was likely 2 to 3 weeks out, close but not close enough to guarantee anyone's safety at the one event Constance couldn't afford to let slip sideways. If she's going to move against you, Cole said, the two of us going over the boat's floor plan at midnight like generals, it's this weekend or never. After the merger closes, the calculation changes completely. She won't need it to look like an accident anymore. She'll just need it to look survivable to a board. So we make sure it doesn't happen at all. We make sure that if it happens on camera, in front of people who can arrest him before anyone touches a fork. I didn't sleep much those last 9 days. I checked my EpiPen every morning. Twice some mornings the old habit sharpened into something closer to a compulsion. I ran my prep exactly the way I always had, allergen-free tools, protein-plated and tasted by my own hand, only no exceptions. Because I had learned the hard way that the one time you make an exception is the only time it matters. The night before, Cole found me on the aft deck one more time, the two of us out of plans for once, just waiting. If this goes wrong tomorrow, I said, I need you to know none of this, the filming, the notebook, any of it, none of it was really about revenge. I just wanted to be the kind of person who gets to grow old doing something ordinary. It's not going to go wrong, he said it like a fact, not reassurance. But if you ever want to tell me the rest of it, the parts you still haven't explained, about how you always seem to already know exactly what's coming before it does, I'll still be here to hear it. No case attached. That's a strange thing to offer someone the night before a possible disaster. I've got good timing, he said. It's sort of my whole job. I laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks, and for exactly one night, before everything that came next, I let myself just be a woman standing on a boat with a man who made her laugh. The morning of the gala, Constance's assistant found the primary camera. I don't know if it was luck, or if someone had finally thought to actually search the galley instead of just the crew's quarters, but by the time I came down for morning prep, the little unit wedged behind the spice rack was gone, and Constance was waiting for me at the counter where Weston usually sat, holding it in one manicured hand like evidence of exactly the kind of person she'd always suspected I was. Recording devices slowing, in a working galley. I have to say, I'm almost impressed by the paranoia. She set it down between us like a chess piece. Whatever you thought you were building toward, I'd let it go. Nobody is going to believe a disgruntled employee's home movies over a family that's owned this boat for 3 generations. For one long, ugly second, standing there with 9 years of preparation apparently reduced to a plastic housing in a woman's palm, I believed her. Then I remembered the second camera, and who was holding it, and that I had never once, in either life, actually needed Constance Ashcroft's permission to survive her. You're right, I told her. I'd let it go too if that were the only one. I watched something in her face flicker, just once, before the composure came back down over it like a shutter. Service that night in the way it always did, chaos wearing the costume of elegance, 40 guests in the wrong shoes on a rocking deck, the closing course exactly what it had always been, chilled lobster and heirloom tomato salad, plated by my own hand, tasted by my own hand, my locked case checked twice before I ever let it leave my sight. Weston found me at the pass just before service the way he always did. You look tired, he said. Let me carry your bag up to the salon for you this time. One less thing. 9 years ago, in a life that no longer exists anywhere except inside me, I said yes to a version of that same sentence and it killed me. This time I looked at him for one long moment, at the man I had genuinely loved, at the fear behind his eyes that I finally understood wasn't cruelty, it was cornered, and I said, that's kind. But I've got it. He didn't argue. He just nodded too quickly and disappeared toward the salon ahead of me, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still, because I recognized that exact too quick nod from 9 years of missing it the first time. I found the case exactly where I'd left it 4 minutes later, in the small crew office off the galley, door unlocked when I always locked it. Weston was already gone. My EpiPen was still inside, sitting in its usual place. It was only when I picked it up, from muscle memory as automatic as breathing, that I registered the weight was wrong, subtly, the kind of wrong you'd only ever catch if you had checked that exact object every single morning for 9 straight years. He had swapped it for a decoy so close to identical that I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that he must have practiced. I did not react the way I had the first time. I did not panic and I did not confront him alone. I stepped back out onto the side deck, caught Cole's eye across a crowd of 40 people who had no idea anything in their evening had just changed, and gave him the single small nod we'd agreed on 9 days earlier. 4 federal agents and 2 county sheriff's deputies, who had been positioned at the marina gate since 6 that evening under the thin cover story of routine dock security, boarded the Meridian Star within 90 seconds. I found Leela in the crowd within seconds, already moving toward me instead of away, her hand finding mine and gripping hard enough to hurt, which was its own kind of answer to a question I hadn't needed to ask her in months. Weston didn't run. I want that noted for whatever it's worth at this point. He stood very still at the edge of the salon, the real EpiPen still in his jacket pocket where he hadn't yet had time to dispose of it, and when Cole read him his rights, he looked past the badge, past his mother's sudden, furious silence by the bar straight at me, and said the only thing he said all night that I believed completely. "I hated every version of this plan," he said. "I want you to know that. I hated it, and I did it anyway, and I don't expect that to matter to you at all." "It doesn't," I said, "but I believe you." Constance's arrest came 19 days later. Once the financial case Cole had 2 years building finally closed around the laundered merger capital, with Lila's testimony about the office conversation I'd overheard filling in exactly the gap his evidence had been missing, including who had actually mailed those forged bank statements 4 years earlier. Vanessa Klein, it turned out, had sourced the decoy EpiPen herself through a pharmaceutical contact left over from her nursing days, a detail that came out of a receipt trail Cole's team had been quietly building since before I'd ever confided in him. She was charged as an accessory within the month. Sterling Marine's merger collapsed the same week, which I understand cost several people at that company a great deal of money, and which I did not spend one single second grieving. We went back to the Meridian Star's aft deck 3 weeks later, after the arraignments and the depositions and the strange, quiet business of watching a family collapse into federal paperwork. Cole and I, both off duty from our respective versions of this catastrophe for the first time in what felt like a decade, which for me, it nearly was. "What do you want?" he asked. "Not what keeps you safe, not what closes the case. What do you actually want, now that nobody's coming for you anymore?" I'd been asked easier questions by the U.S. Attorney's Office. "I want to run a galley where checking my own bag every morning is just a habit again, instead of a countdown," I said. "I want to stop being the version of myself who has to survive everything twice before it counts. And I think, if you're not planning on chartering this boat under a fake corporate account anymore, I'd like to actually get to know the real one." He laughed, the first real laugh I'd heard from him since Lila said his name out loud on that deck weeks earlier, and took my hand the way he had 100 times before without either of us naming what it meant. "I've got nowhere else I'm supposed to be," he said. "For the first time in 2 years, that's just true. Not cover." Lila had already given notice at the family's holding company by then, enrolling instead in a master's program 3 states away, done, she told me, with spending her whole life managing other people's damage. I didn't blame her. I understood completely. The Meridian Star still smelled like fresh paint somewhere underneath 10 years of use, if you knew to look for it, and for the first time since I'd woken up gasping in this exact galley, I wasn't in a hurry to leave it. I did not have to check my bag twice tonight. I checked it once anyway, out of habit, and for the first time in 10 years, it was exactly, boringly, safely mine. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.